Hello and welcome to All You Can Board. I'm Carlo and today I'm going to be reviewing Paris, la Cité de la Lumière, as well as the Eiffel expansion. So this is a two-player Polyomino based game. It's designed by Jose Antonio Abascal with art by Oriol Hernandez, and it's published by Devir Games. I do want to mention quick that the base game here as well as the Eiffel expansion were both sent to us by Devir Games as review copies. So I'm going to start by giving you kind of an overview of sort of basically how the game plays, and then I'm going to talk about kind of what the base game has compared to what the expansion brings. I'll tell you my thoughts on all of them, and at the end whether the expansion feels like a necessary addition and all that kind of stuff. So basically this is a two-phase game. It plays in two halves, so if you're familiar with games like For Sale, Fjords, Blue Lagoon, stuff like that, where you basically play one half of the game and then there's a slightly different set of rules for the second half, that's how this plays out. Each player starts with 8 of these cobblestone tiles. You have the box in the middle of the table. You're actually playing building in the box itself. And the first phase of the game, you have two options on your turn. You're either placing the tile that's in your hand, the cobblestone tile, in which case if you do, you just draw a new one, so you're always holding one, the rest are in a stack. And if you're not placing one of your cobblestone street tiles, you're reserving one of these polyomino buildings, which will actually get placed in the second phase. So the first phase, you just go back and forth. Again, you're either placing a cobblestone tile to build out this map. There's no placement restrictions. You can place it in any of these 16 spaces. Doesn't matter if it's adjacent to a previously placed tile. The colors don't have to line up. Nothing really matters like that. Or again, you're reserving a building tile. That's it for the first phase. I'll just quickly show you. The tiles, the cobblestone tiles will have up to three different colors on them, as well as these street lights. One player is orange and one player is blue, so that's what those spaces are. And the purple spaces are mixed color spaces. And what that means is that in the second phase of the game, when we're actually placing the buildings, you can place either on your own color or the mixed color, which is the shared purple spaces. So the second phase plays out kind of in a similar way, where you basically just have two options. You're going to have your reserve of tiles that you had from the first phase, and so on your turn you're either going to be placing one of your reserve tiles somewhere on the board, again on either your color and or mixed color spaces, or you're going to be you have 4 of these little action tokens, and there's these 8 action postcards that are set up at the start of the game. There's a whole bunch, I think there's 12 in the base game, and you pick 8 at random. You can always mix and match them. There's a bunch of other ones in the expansion as well, but you're basically setting these up so you're going to be either placing a tile from your reserve in the second phase or activating an action postcard. And what that means is you'll take one of your little action tokens, place it on the card, and then you'll resolve the ability. So some of these are immediate effects where you get a token and you put it on the board and it has some type of effect. Other ones you gain and you can use later on throughout the game at certain points, but they're basically going to affect either the layout of the map or affect someone's scoring of buildings in some way and that kind of thing. And basically, yeah, the second phase just ends and the game ends once all of the 8 action spaces have been claimed by the players, 4 each, as well as all the buildings that we have in our reserves have been placed, or you just can't place buildings anymore. And then we just count final points. And basically you get points for if you're familiar with King Domino, the buildings in this game kind of score in a similar way, where, you know, King Domino, it's the number of spaces times the crowns. In this game, think of it as the size of your building times the number of street lights casting light on it. So the whole theme of the game is, Paris is considered the city of lights. And so you're basically trying to get as many street lights as you can shining on your buildings. Let's say you have a building that takes up 4 spaces and there are 3 street lights shining on it, then it's 4 times 3, 12 points for that building. So you score each of your buildings. You also score points for your longest connected chain of buildings that belongs to you. Sometimes some of the action postcards might get you points, and then each player also gets -3 points at the end of the game if they have any buildings in their reserve that they didn't actually place. So that's pretty much it. Most of the kind of like rules complexity from the game comes from what each of the action postcards do, especially because from game to game, you might be introducing new ones. So I'm not going to explain what they all do, but just to give you some examples, this one here, Chartier, with this little purple tile, means that once you claim it, you hold on to this piece, and then on a future turn, you can use this purple mixed color tile to cover one of your opponent's color spaces, and then place a building on top of it. Another one, there's this La Grande Lumière, is basically the big street light. This one just like casts light even further, so you can illuminate more buildings. There's all kinds of stuff. This one, Bouquinis sur la Seine, is a little annex piece that you add on to increase the size of one of your buildings by 1, but it has to be placed on a space of your color. There's all kinds of stuff like that. It's very interesting the way it lets you manipulate the map. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the rules overview. So now I want to talk about what the game actually feels like. Like, how does the game make you feel while you're playing? What are some games that might be similar, kind of thing? So it's interesting because there aren't a whole lot of 2-player only Polyomino games out there. The first one that comes to mind is obviously Patchwork, but Patchwork is very different because in Patchwork, even though like a lot of the time in Polyomino games, in terms of the interaction in the game and the kind of shared space is usually just where you're drafting tiles. And something like Patchwork, you each have your own quilt. You're just focusing on your own quilt and building in front of you, whereas this, it's all done in a shared space. So this is a much more interactive, much more, it's kind of a deceptively mean game, I have to say. A lot of times in this game, you're actually more, a lot of the time it makes more sense to take the move that actually gets in your opponent's way more than the thing that helps you. So you have to be, like, if you're not paying attention to what your opponent's up to, which, buildings they have and which action postcards they're activating, you're probably going to lose the game because it sort of feels like whoever gets in the other person's way better. If I take one of these big buildings and there's a part where I can place it with a bunch of streetlights next to it, and my opponent sees, hey, that's going to be a huge scoring opportunity, like 20-some points, they might take a certain action postcard to manipulate the board in a way that maybe they cover a space, and now I can't actually place that building there. And now not only is that not going to get me those points, but I might be stuck with that building in my reserve and lose 3 points at the end of the game. And then I might be, activating a different action postcard to negate the points of one of my opponent's buildings. So there's almost as much of, denying your opponent, getting in each other's way, that kind of take that is, just as important or maybe even more important than focusing on what you yourself are doing. So that right there makes it a very different game from Patchwork as well as Polyomino games in general. Like, a lot of the time these spatial awareness kind of tile laying games, a lot of the time you have your own personal area and you're just doing your own thing undisturbed. And yeah, this is definitely a lot meaner, and you definitely have to pay very close attention to what your opponent's doing. So just in terms of comparing it to Patchwork, very different games like that. It does have the variable setup, which I really like. Obviously, you have the different action postcards. Even just like changing 2 or 3 of them out and putting in different ones will make the game could feel very different. And the other thing is, because each player has these 8 cobblestone tiles and you're building the map in the first phase, the way the map gets built is always going to be very different too. So you might have one map, at the end of the first phase, one game, you might look and say, oh, I have this big path of orange and purple connected spaces. I'm going to be able to make a huge connection of buildings, or there might be a really big spot with a bunch of streetlights near it that you can, like maybe 1 or 2 really lucrative places on the board where you think there's going to be big scoring opportunities. And in other games, it might be that all the streetlights are kind of on the perimeters. They're maybe not going to be touching as many buildings. There's not as many points up for grabs. Maybe all the colors are split up a bit more, so you don't want to take as many of the big buildings. Like, I really like that from game to game, you really have to assess right from the start of the game which action postcards are out there, and keep that in mind as you're building, and what are you trying to kind of work towards. And then as the game goes on, there's all these interesting timing considerations to make where you think, okay, I kind of want to take that big building, but if I take it right now, I don't currently have a path where I'm going to be able to place it on the board later, so maybe I don't reserve that yet. Maybe I'll put down a tile instead to create that path. But if I do, and my opponent sees that path where the tile could go, then maybe they go reserve that tile, and I think, now I'm not even going to be able to place that anyway. Why did I place that cobblestone tile on the board? But it could happen the other way around too, where I take, I reserve the tile first, and then my opponent places a cobblestone piece on the street somewhere where it doesn't allow me to actually connect it. Now I have this building that I'm not going to actually be able to place or whatnot. So there's different ways that you can get in each other's way, and it's all about kind of assessing what is my opponent's highest priority right now and what is my highest priority. What can I afford to do? What's most important right now? Do I need to get that tile out there to make that connection? Do I need to reserve a particular building before my opponent steals it from me, because they're all unique buildings? There's no, like, if someone takes it, you can't just say, oh, well, there's another one of those in the supply. And even just the idea of the first person to place all their cobblestone tiles in the first phase is the player who gets to take the first turn in the second phase. So if you know that your biggest point scoring opportunity is reliant on having a specific action postcard and you're going to need to get it, then you're going to try and be the first person to place those cobblestone tiles so that you can, take that first turn and take that action postcard. But then if you take an action postcard on your first turn in the second phase, someone else might, or your opponent might spend their turn covering up those purple mixed spaces, because, the more that you cover those purple shared spaces, it means your opponent isn't going to get to them, and they're going to be kind of more restricted to just their own color. So there's all these little kind of things that you're racing to, is like, which spaces are the most hotly contested on the board, which action postcards. So I really like that you have to always be reassessing the state of the game right from right from setup, and then as the game goes on and the board develops and different tiles get taken from the reserve, like, it's a very organic game. Everything is always shifting, and you can't just make a strategy at the beginning of the game and say, I'm going to stubbornly stick to this and go for it. There's all these tactical considerations to make where you have to say, you know what, I'm going to abandon this strategy, or, oh, this tile that I thought was going to go there, I'm actually going to have to place it somewhere else, because then it allows me to make a bigger chain of these buildings or whatnot. So lots of interesting stuff to consider there. Another big draw to the game really is just like the artwork and the theme. As someone who's been to Paris, I believe 3 times now, you know, it's awesome seeing all these familiar like sort of monuments and landmarks that I saw when I was there, and the fact that they're all thematic. They kind of, even though they have their own little rules explanations in the rule book, sometimes you forget what they are. But as someone who's been there, if you know what this, you know, landmark represents, you can it kind of jogs your memory right away about the rule. Like, okay, this is the one where if you place it on the edge of the board or whatnot. So some of that I'll get back to when I talk about the expansion. So, you know, why not get into it right now? The Eiffel expansion introduces 8 new of these action postcards. So you can either mix and match them with the base game, you can play with just the expansion postcards, whatnot. Other than that, it just comes with like a scoring pad, and I think that's pretty much it. So the main thing is just the components that come with the extra action postcards, but you're getting the actual Eiffel Tower, which wasn't in the base game. You're getting the catacombs, which is very cool. You basically put out this little skull somewhere, and then when someone builds a building, they're basically building over your catacombs, so you're going to get half of the points that building scores for at the end, because they built over your land, basically. You know, there's the Quartier Pauvre, which, if you're familiar with the way Paris is laid out, and it has the kind of spiral layout, and the I believe they call them the arrondissement on the outside, which is like the kind of more low-income areas, it makes sense. It's called the Quartier Pauvre, and you're getting extra points for being able to touch all the edges of the city, kind of thing. So there's a lot of cool little like thematic things. The game, everything just kind of like makes sense. And just again, it does feel like really like a love letter to the city of Paris, and I think people who are either French or have been to Paris or have a particular you know, affinity for the city will definitely have like an added level of appreciation, and I think this does a great job of making it truly feel like it is a game about Paris. So it's probably pretty clear that I do like this game quite a bit, but there are some negatives. The first thing I'll mention is that the action postcards themselves have, you know, like I mentioned before, it's the only part of the rules that has any like sort of complexity that you might forget. I've now played Paris total with the base game and expansion. I've now played 5 times, and even on my most recent plays, 4th and 5th plays, I still had to go back to the rule book for little reminders about the action postcards. And it wasn't just before the game, it was during the game as well, because again, some of them are, you know, when you take it, something happens immediately. Other ones say keep this in reserve, and then on a future turn you can use it for this. Some of them say something that you can do, but it has to be you place this thing on one of your own spaces. Other ones say that it can be your own space or mixed colored spaces. Other ones even go on your opponent's colored spaces, or your own buildings or your opponent's buildings. So there's all these little variations, and you know, most of these have an explanation that's like a paragraph, couple sentences or whatnot, but when you're playing with 8 of them, then you change them out and you bring in new ones, and the fact that they all have these little differences, it does lead to a lot more checking of a rule book than I would like, especially for a game that plays in about 30 minutes, and that I've played multiple times over. It is a little bit annoying to feel like I have to keep going back and checking the rules. Oh no, that one was immediate, I'm not supposed to keep this in my possession, kind of thing. And I feel like it was a bit of a missed opportunity, because the postcards themselves, I'll show you, I mean, one side is just looks like an actual postcard, very nice artwork, like they're beautiful. But the other side is mostly blank. It's showing like the tile that you're going to get and the name of the action or whatnot. But I feel like there's a bit of a missed opportunity where they could have had either a bit of text or even a symbol. Maybe there could have been an icon that represents immediate, and then another one that it represents like in your supply, so you kind of just remember by looking at, oh right, that one I keep and use later or whatever. Or it might show the outline of what type of space you can place it on, your own or mixed color. I wish there were some indicators on there that would prevent you from having to go open up the rule book and having 2 players passing the rule book back and forth looking up these things. So that's a little annoying thing. I think if you played the game enough, eventually you will memorize them, so it's not a huge issue, but especially for our first few games, you're probably going to be going back to the rule book more than you'd like. Another thing I'll say is the game can induce quite a bit of analysis paralysis, and it's tough to fault the game for this, because a lot of the time that is up to the players. But the thing is, a lot of these kind of like, you know, small box two-player games that play in half an hour or whatnot, a lot of the time you can plan your turn when it's not your turn, right? Your opponent's going, and you can come up with a plan. And obviously there's times in other games too where players get in your way, but it feels like in this game, more than half the time, even if I had my turn figured out, by the time my opponent takes their turn, it usually messed with my plan in some way. Especially, I find the more you play the game and the better you get, and the more you get, like, the experience you gain in the game playing with someone else who has also played it more, it feels like the game goes more from how can I maximize my own score or whatever, to how can I get in the other person's way, which is awesome. I mean, it makes, in some ways, it makes it a more, interactive, more interesting, a deeper game, but also it makes it so that it feels like when it gets to you, you have to restart your thinking again from scratch because the board state will probably have changed from before. So just keep that in mind, especially if analysis paralysis is an issue for you or that's not something you like in your games. There can be a decent amount of it, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be an always present thing. There are ways around it, and sometimes the game is going to play out where maybe you can't block each other as much and you can plan 2 or 3 moves in advance, and sometimes it's not going to really stand in your way, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. The other thing is, this I don't really think of as a negative for me personally, but I think it's worth mentioning because some people might not like this. This is the type of game where you can sometimes feel, maybe not in the first phase, it's never too early in the game, but at some point in the second phase of the game when you see the board kind of developing, you might start to feel like, I already know I lost this game, or now that one big scoring opportunity I got was blocked, I have nowhere to pivot. Like, I now can't place this big thing that I thought was going to score me 20-some points, and not only can I not place it, but now I'm stuck with it, and it's -3 points at the end. That's going to be a huge swing, and sometimes you look around and you think, I'm not going to be able to slow my opponent down enough, so sometimes one big move or 2 big moves by your opponent or a bad move by yourself can completely get you out of the game, or feel like your plan is completely fallen apart and there's kind of no way to pivot and readjust. Sometimes it's just, oh well, I'll try again next game kind of thing. So just something worth keeping in mind, especially if you like to feel like it's a tight thing and you feel like you have, a hope to win right to the end. That being said, I will offer an alternative to that, which is that one of the times I played this with my wife, almost the entire game we thought I was going to be winning by quite a bit. Like, she wasn't feeling good about the way she was playing. I kept thinking I was going to win by a decent amount, and then we counted the scores, and she actually won by like 10 or 12 points because we didn't realize how much something was going to score for. So yeah, it can really go either way, but I do think it's something worth keeping in mind. So is the expansion necessary? It's tough to say. I think if you're getting this game as something to just kind of have on your shelf, play a couple times a year, just as another option, and it's not going to be one of your favorite games, I think the base game is really solid on its own, and I think even just having 12 postcards where you only use 8, they're going to be mixed and matched in different ways. I think if you think this is a game that you're not going to, it's not going to be one of your go-to games in your collection, that you're just playing maybe, 5, 10, 15 times total in your lifetime, I think you've got plenty in the base game. I don't think you need the expansion. That being said, when I heard there was an expansion for the game, I was a little skeptical, thinking, oh, it's just a small box 2-player game, like, does it really need an expansion? But once I actually played it, it did seem like a pretty ideal expansion because it doesn't increase the rules complexity in any way in terms of how you actually play the game. All it does is introduce more action postcards, which just gives you a lot more variety. And these ones, I have to say, are more challenging. They're trickier, especially stuff like the Eiffel Tower is a tricky one to use well, but can be a very powerful piece to use. So I think adding in the Eiffel expansion is just going to give this game a lot more legs. And if you play the base game a few times, you think, oh, I really like this game. This is going to be a regular game I play with, my significant other or with roommate or whoever. Then the expansion is definitely a good bet to add it, just again to add to the longevity of the game. I mean, there's going to be a lot to explore in this over time. I feel like even just the more I've played it, I've seen sort of a bit of a meta start to develop in terms of who's going for which tile from the reserve, or what's this big scoring opportunity going to be, or when you see this happening here, one way to counteract it is to go for that specific action postcard. But I'm also still being surprised, even on my last game that I played last night, the 5th time I've played this. Some of these action postcards are being used in ways that I hadn't considered before, or we're getting a lot more points than I'd ever seen them get, and some of them are better or worse in, depending which game you're playing, depending on either how the map got laid out at the start or which tiles people have. So it's always this kind of like shifting puzzle that you have to kind of recalibrate how you're approaching. So I think the game has a lot of kind of like long-term replay value, especially if you're playing, again, with the same person and you're kind of, developing your skill levels alongside each other. Even though it's a fairly easy game to get into, once I've played this game, 5, 10 times, it's not necessarily something that I'm going to be introducing to new people, unless it's something that I think, hey, you would really like this game, I want to show you what it's like. But I think I'm going to gravitate now more towards playing it with the same, I've played it with Dylan, and I've also played it with my wife, and those are probably the people that I'm going to want to keep playing this game with, since they already know it, and I've played it, 5 times or whatnot. And so this game sits in a bit of a weird spot for me, because the fact that it's 2-player only, obviously it makes it a bit of a niche niche game. It is a polyomino game, but again, it's on an opposite kind of spectrum as Patchwork because of the fact that it's very interactive and there's a lot of kind of, you're essentially just trying to block your opponent all game. And it's just, again, the complexity of the action postcards means there's a little bit more like checking the rule book. Like I can't say I've had to go back to the rule book of something like Patchwork once I start playing. So it sits in a bit of a weird space where I really like it, but I wonder if I'm at home playing games with my wife and she suggests like a polyomino game, she's probably going to suggest something where we each have our own board, like Patchwork or Spring Meadow or whatnot, where we're not actually competing with each other. And if I wanted to, you know, play a more confrontational, fighty, interactive kind of game where we're trying to block each other, if I'm playing with someone who likes those types of games more, we might be, you know, defaulting to something like Carcassonne, or, you know, even as far as card games go, something like Battle Line or Lost Cities. And all those games have such simple rules that I never have to check them again. It's just, you get the game to the table and it's just a very quick, smooth experience. And this one just has those little barriers with the action postcards and those complexity that it feels like it's never going to be my first choice game with any group, but I also think it's something I'm very happy to have in my collection, and I'm going to enjoy it every time I play it. I will definitely request to be the one to play it every once in a while because I do really like it. It's something that I think will have a lot of value over long-term plays. So that's pretty much all I have to say about Paris, la Cité de la Lumière and the Eiffel expansion. I think this is a great game. If you're looking for something, you know, again, very interactive and confrontational as a two-player game, if you're looking for a different spin on polyominoes, I guess I forgot to mention that these polyominoes, you can see the way that they're kind of layered, they can't be flipped over on the opposite side. So there's certain ones that, you know, you're a little more restricted than in other polyomino games. And the fact that really, I call it a polyomino game, but really each player is only going to place usually about 3 or 4 polyominoes in the whole game because you're going to be limited to where you can go. So maybe I shouldn't be classifying it as a polyomino game, but it is a pretty, you know, distinct feature, and you are going to be laying polyominoes in every game, and that's a big way that you're actually scoring your points. But yeah, I think it's a great game, one that I recommend you check out if it looks like you're into this type of thing. Again, a 2-player kind of head-to-head tug-of-war style game. Curious to know your thoughts, any first impressions. If you haven't played it, or if you have played it, let me know what you think. Is this one of your favorite 2-player games? Did it fall flat for you? If so, why? Always curious to hear what you have to think. Please leave a comment below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.